Hello. Now, if you follow me, you'll know a little bit about me and the fact that I actually advocate quite strongly for equal rights, especially disability equal rights. Now, you may not know, a few weeks ago, I entered the local Festival of Running. And the backstory from this race, I tried to enter it the first year I became disabled as a wheelchair entry and was told I could not because they didn't allow wheelchair entries. Anyway, long story short, managed to get the committee to talk to me. We did a recce around the course, and now the 5K course is open to general wheelchair entries, and that is solely to the and that is solely because of my advocacy with regards to wheelchair entries. I did it that year. I couldn't do it the following year because I had broken my wheelchair. Anyway, fast forwards. So this year I went down to enter, and I wanted to do the 10K. Now, I didn't know whether I would be able to or not, but I had spoken to some locals about the course and what bits differ for the 10K, because this is an off-road track, and the local park runners thought that the rest of the track should be wheelchair friendly. I went down to enter, and I asked them could I enter the 10K. The people that were there at the time, from the running club, said yes. I talked about a bridge that has a lip and how I'd get over that. People had indicated that maybe some of the rises might be a bit steep, and I'm an ambulatory wheelchair user, so I can actually get out and walk if I need to. And the race director was there. She agreed to swap numbers with me, and that I would check in with her after I've gotten back from the out and back section of the course, so that she knew everything was fine. The night before, so I entered that weekend, late that night, I got a phone call back saying that I was not allowed to enter. They were withdrawing my entry because the council said I couldn't, and because wheelchairs weren't allowed. Now, obviously, this was red flag to a bull for me. So I just set about finding out what in the heck was going on here. The first thing I had to do was find out who maintains the track. Now, I went round and round between Invercargill City Council, Southland District Council and Environment Southland to find out who it was that maintained the track. It turns out that the track is maintained by two different councils, which doesn't make things easy for the event organisers. So the loop track that goes round the estuary, the one I had gotten approved with them before, that is maintained by the City Council, and the City Council are perfectly happy with wheelchair users using that track. So that wasn't the problem. So what I did not know until I recently spoke to a committee member was that the track is divided at the section where the boardwalk starts and the track carries on towards Bluff. That next section is maintained by Environment Southland. So what does that mean for permissions? Well, apparently the athletics club have already spoken to both parties in previous years, and Invercargill City Council are perfectly happy with wheelchairs using the estuary track, so nothing was needed to be done there separately or anything else. The battle at the beginning was because the athletics club are run completely on volunteers, and it was purely a case of you don't know what you don't know. So thankfully the athletics club talked to me that time. We did recce round it. They were able to see how a wheelchair negotiates that sort of track, because it's not something they've been exposed to before. And then the council approved wheelchairs, so that was fine. That means the athletics club don't need to do anything extra with regards to any of their risk assessments, because the council has said it's fine, and that goes under the council's risk assessment. However, once you cross this junction at the end of the boardwalk going out of town, that section is maintained by Environment Southland. Now, when the athletics club contacted Environment Southland about wheelchairs using that section, they said this. So apparently the terrain makes it unsuitable for wheelchairs. It is too narrow, and the bridges are too difficult to negotiate. Now, what neither of us could work out was how Environment Southland were going to first know that, and second manage that. If they're saying a wheelchair can't use that track, what's to stop me from going down there and using it? Or how are they going to know? The question is, they won't. So I suppose I have to go and find out for myself. Okay, I am down on the track. Behind me there, in that direction, is the track that goes back to Invercargill, and over there's the other section of it, and behind me going that way is the Environment Southland part of the track. The rest of it is reasonably well maintained cinder path up till here. Today it's really fairly windy, and that has picked up recently, so I'm not sure how far down this track I'm going to get, because it's really hard work in the wind. But let's see what the path is actually like. Okay, so I honestly don't understand. I am 2.2 k's down the track. I don't need to go any further, because I can see it's all the same as this. It's perfectly wide enough. There are no places where the bank on the side it drops straight off, so I could get over onto the grass if need be. And people argue that this wheelchair is wider than a runner. Well, it actually isn't, because the wheelchair is as wide as my shoulders, so it's not sticking out any further than I would be. So the fact remains that the Environment Southland won't let wheelchairs use this track, but I've just passed a walker and I'm down here on this track on a wheelchair. So what the hell? So we spoke at length about various different things, the sorts of challenges they come upon, and how they run the athletics club as a volunteer-led club. And the challenges for them are getting volunteers that are willing to help them run it, and that are happy with the circumstances they're placed in, and that they're not given any extra jobs, which is fair enough. So they were concerned that they might have extra stuff to do if there's wheelchairs in the event. I explained that they wouldn't have any extra stuff to do because a wheelchair user would be able to deal with that themselves, and there is a certain degree of personal risk involved, like there would be with a normal able-bodied human. But as you may appreciate, people do worry about these things, even if they don't need to be worried about. I know this because if I'm just like minding my own business, mooching through town in my wheelchair, people go, "Oh my gosh, are you all right?" and things like that. So we've got a bit of that going on. I mean, that's always going to happen. I'm glad that it's that and not that they don't give a shit. Anyway, so they have got to get the volunteers. They've also got to get the risk assessments past the council. Now, the risk assessments have to go to two different councils, the Invercargill City Council and Environment Southland, because two councils maintain different parts of the track. They have had quite obstructive responses from Environment Southland with regards to wheelchairs using that track, because they don't want it. They don't believe it's possible. They don't believe it's suitable. So that means that any attempt at a risk assessment for that section of the track is going to become more difficult. On top of that, an athletics club has to have a qualified person doing the risk assessment and submitting it. So the more complicated the risk assessment gets, the more pressure that puts on the volunteers in the athletics club. And that would mean then that less people would want to do it if it becomes a complicated job. That I understand. So, although I don't see why the event couldn't go ahead, because that section of the track would be perfectly fine, in my humble opinion, the fact that they've got all of these other things, barriers put in place by other people, makes it quite tricky. So we talked about how we could possibly do that. We talked about having a different course. And I said that the offer of doing 2 loops of the 5K track for me, I didn't want it to be made special just for me. I wanted to have equal opportunities and equal rights and equal access to the event like everyone else. So if they are doing the 10K course, then why can't I? Then we talked about entries for wheelchair specific, because there has not been any of those in the past. Wheelchairs have gone in with the general public, and they've had to contact the event organisers if they're a wheelchair athlete to talk about their the equipment they use and that sort of thing. So we floated that idea too, so that you would enter as a wheelchair entry or as a regular able-bodied person. We also talked about para entry, which in my opinion would get too complicated, because if you entered as a para, there was all sorts of different levels of para, and there's about 15 categories, and that makes it too complex for a volunteer-run athletics club to deal with. So I said, my suggestion was that anybody who doesn't need a wheelchair just goes in with the able-bodied category as such. And then that means that if you're entering, you would have to enter under a wheelchair entry. The advantage for the athletics club here is that they wouldn't need to manage that. At the moment, they're having to troll through and find the people that are wheelchair entries, make sure they make contract, make sure it's accessible and all that sort of thing. That would get rid of all that bureaucracy, because the person would choose wheelchair entry instantly. The bureaucracy then becomes the battle between the two councils. So we then talked about making the wheelchair entry a separate entry and making the wheelchair course a separate course. And she asked me how I'd feel about that. Now that, in my opinion, is perfectly acceptable. I don't feel discriminated against if it's a wheelchair entry and the wheelchair course is that. That, to me, is perfectly acceptable. If I'm an entry and, oh, because you're that, you have to do this, and because they're that, they have to do that, that becomes a little bit more of a grey area. If you're going to define it clearly in the stand with a wheelchair entry and not, that, I think, makes it better, in my opinion. Get rid of all of the different types of para categories, because that's too complicated. So anybody who's willing to do it on 2 feet, then they go in with all the other people, because the wheelchair is what we are catering for that's different. So then the wheelchair course, if we're keeping out of Environment Southland because they're being complex and tricky, then that would mean that the wheelchair course would be 2 laps of the lagoon. This is what they offered me in the first place, but I didn't want to do it because it was a special case just for me. However, if you're saying to me all of the wheelchair entries have got to do that course, that becomes more acceptable for me because I'm in a wheelchair, so therefore I do that. It's perfectly okay to have a different course that's more accessible for somebody with disability needs, as long as you're not separating that person out from every other entry in the place. We talked about wheelchair entries specifically and how much need she felt there would be for that. Now here is when it becomes a bit of a grey area, because in Southland, I know for sure, because I've talked about this with the prosthetics department, there is a really big dropout rate for people that were engaged in sport that become disabled and then after their disability, their required disability, then disengage with sport. There's a really high percentage of people that do that. My opinion is because life becomes a whole lot more fucking complicated, and on top of that, the accessibility thing in society is really not what everybody thinks it is. So you've got to battle for everything. And if you've followed me on social media, you will know that that is the case. Here is a prime example, for example. So, yes, I am glad that, one, the athletics club opened the 5K course to general entries, and I'm also, number 2, glad that they've had other people enter in subsequent years. They've also opened up talks with other local children's disability organisations and had those people involved in sport, and that is great. And the person that I was talking to said that that is largely because of the fact that I asked to open up conversations about disability access when I first wanted to enter that 5K race. So that makes me feel really good that we've got those conversations going on. But all those people around the place that use wheelchairs and want to enter races, the challenge we have is that the bureaucracy is stopping so many race organisers from using roads that they're just not doing it anymore. The athletics clubs here, in this case, have stopped using the road course that they used to have, which was on a state highway here, because of the cost involved in all of the paperwork they had to do, the road closures, the traffic management, the fees that they were able to charge, the entry numbers they'd get just didn't cover all of the costs involved with road closures, because we're a small population down here in Southland and sponsorship for the organisation to run the race is really quite negligible. So that's why it's an off-road course in the first place. So if you flip that over, the reason I am asking to do this is because, well, everyone else in New Zealand is having the same problem, and there are very few road-based wheelchair accessible events left in the country. I struggled to find any when I was looking after I wasn't allowed to do this. So she could appreciate the challenge that I've got, as well as the fact I can appreciate the challenge they have got. So I am hoping that following this conversation we can come to another arrangement perhaps for next year, where there's a separate wheelchair entry and their wheelchairs do a different course to the people on 2 feet. The 5K course is wider, better maintained, and it'll be easier for people to come past wheelchairs because the runners are all running in the same direction. Down the other track that Environment Southland don't want us to use, there's runners running in both directions, and the track's not as well maintained and it's narrower. So that is where we've got to so far. Fingers crossed a 10K race for wheelchairs will be allowed next year. So I guess it's another case of watch this space, and thank you to the Harriers for taking the time out to talk to me about this so we could try and find a solution for everyone.